They're just so busy with soccer practice this weekend. My sister's voice chirped through the phone, the pride unmistakable as she detailed my niece and nephew's packed schedule. In the background, I could hear my mother's delighted response. Well, we'll rearrange everything. Nothing's more important than seeing those two perform. I glanced at my own children, Ellie drawing quietly in the corner, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration, and Max meticulously lining up his dinosaurs by size. The rejection letter for Max's art therapy program sat heavily on the counter. 3 months of waiting, only to be told that his behavioral challenges made him not quite the right fit. My parents had canceled their visit that same morning with a brief text. Something came up. Maybe next month. The familiar ache bloomed in my chest, not sharp like a new wound, but worn smooth like a river stone I'd been carrying for years. I'd learned to accommodate its weight, to breathe around it, to smile at my children while it pressed against my ribs. I'd become fluent in the language of excuses, translating rejection into palatable half-truths. Grandma and Grandpa are busy. They love you, but they're just not good at showing it. Everyone expresses love differently. But the truth was simpler and more painful. My children were the invisible ones, existing in the shadows cast by their cousin's golden glow. For years, I had told myself it was circumstantial, coincidental. The way my parents' eyes seemed to glaze over when I spoke about Max's sensory processing struggles or Ellie's social anxiety. The forgotten birthdays that were just an oversight. The school plays they missed while never failing to attend my sister's children's events. Proudly posting photos captioned, "Our amazing grandkids," from just 2 hours away. "Mom?" Max's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "Can I wear my dinosaur shirt to school tomorrow?" I nodded, forcing brightness into my voice. "Of course, buddy." My children had become experts at masking their disappointment. "It's okay, Mom," Max would say, his small voice steady as he folded his handmade card for grandparents who wouldn't show. "I know they're probably really busy." The practiced nonchalance in an 8-year-old broke something inside me each time. Ellie, at 11, had stopped asking about visits altogether. She'd simply look up when I mentioned my parents, her eyes carrying a wisdom too old for her face, and then return to whatever she was doing. Her silence spoke volumes. The lesson already learned, the hope already abandoned. I remember the first time I noticed the pattern. Ellie was just 3, spinning in excited circles in a dress I'd sewn for her birthday. My parents had promised to come, their first visit in months. I'd spent days preparing, cleaning every corner of our modest home, baking Ellie's favorite strawberry cake, hanging streamers in her favorite colors. "Grandma and Grandpa are coming to my birthday," she'd announced to everyone at her preschool, the teacher told me, amused by her exuberance. They called an hour before they were due to arrive. My sister's son had a cold, nothing serious, just a sniffle, and they thought they should stay to help out. "We'll make it up to her," my mother promised. "She won't even remember. She's so young." But Ellie did remember. She sat by the window in her special dress until the sky darkened, her small face a study in patient hope. When I finally coaxed her away from her vigil, she asked in a whisper, "Did I do something wrong, Mommy?" The question haunted me through the years, surfacing in different forms as my children grew. When Max would carefully modulate his excitement around my parents, suppressing his natural enthusiasm about dinosaurs or space. When Ellie would offer timid, abbreviated answers to their distracted questions. They were learning to make themselves smaller, more palatable, less themselves. And still, it wasn't enough. Meanwhile, my sister's children were celebrated for their every ordinary achievement. Ballet recitals became command performances. Soccer games were treated as professional matches. Their artwork was framed and displayed. Their stories were repeated at family gatherings. My parents rearranged vacations around their schedules, learned the names of their friends, remembered their preferences for birthday gifts. "Your sister just makes it easier," my mother once said when I gently broached the subject. "Her kids are so conventional. You know what I mean." I did know. Conventional meant neurotypical. Conventional meant socially confident. Conventional meant without the sensory issues that sometimes led to Max's meltdowns or the anxiety that occasionally rendered Ellie mute in large gatherings. Conventional meant easier to love, at least for them. The breaking point came during last Thanksgiving. My mother had spent the afternoon fawning over my niece's dance recital photos, cooing over my nephew's soccer trophies. Ellie made honor roll this semester, I offered, placing my hand on my daughter's shoulder. And Max's teacher says he's reading 2 grade levels above. That's nice, dear, my mother interrupted, barely glancing up. Did you see what Amber made for her science fair? Jessica, show her the pictures again. I watched Ellie's shoulders slump almost imperceptibly. Max fidgeted with his utensils, his face flushing with familiar shame. Later, I found him hiding in the guest room, rocking slightly with his hands over his ears. I don't talk right, he whispered when I knelt beside him. That's why Grandma and Grandpa don't like me. The raw heartbreak in his voice crystallized everything I'd been trying not to see. For years, I had been trying to build bridges that my parents had no intention of crossing. I had been teaching my children that love must be earned, that they were somehow deficient when the problem had never been them at all. In that moment, kneeling on the floor beside my son, I felt something shift inside me, grief transforming into resolve. The familiar desire to smooth things over, to protect my parents' feelings, to maintain the fiction of family harmony evaporated, replaced by a fierce, clarifying anger. Not the destructive kind that burns everything in its path, but the protective kind that forges boundaries in its heat. You talk exactly right, I told him, cupping his face in my hands. You talk like Max, and that's perfect. He studied my face, searching for the lie he'd grown accustomed to finding when adults reassured him. Finding none, he leaned his forehead against mine, a rare physical connection that he initiated only when feeling completely safe. That night, after the children were asleep, I sat alone in the kitchen, turning my wedding ring around my finger, a nervous habit I developed during difficult parent-teacher conferences and therapy evaluations. My husband David found me there, staring into a cold cup of tea. Enough, I said simply when he sat across from me. I'm done pretending this is normal or acceptable. David's relief was palpable. For years, he'd watched me contort myself trying to win my parents' approval and attention for our children. He'd held me through tears after disappointing visits, helped me craft careful emails that wouldn't offend, supported my endless efforts to facilitate a relationship that my parents showed little interest in nurturing. What changed? He asked quietly. Everything, I replied. And nothing. I just finally saw it clearly. I began to create careful distance. I stopped the desperate invitations, the carefully orchestrated visits where I coached my children on how to be easier, as if their beautiful, complex selves were somehow wrong. I focused instead on healing our small unit, on teaching Max and Ellie that they were worthy of unconditional love exactly as they were. The process was both liberating and terrifying. Years of conditioning had taught me that maintaining family harmony was my responsibility, regardless of the cost. Each unanswered text from my parents sent waves of guilt through me. Each holiday approach brought anxiety and doubt. Was I being selfish? Was I overreacting? Was I depriving my children of relationships they needed? But then I would watch them at home, in the safety of our acceptance. We found our own traditions, Sunday morning pancakes, where Ellie could experiment with increasingly elaborate toppings. Nature walks, where Max could stop and examine every interesting rock without being rushed along. Movie nights, where sensory breaks were built in without comment or judgment. I watched their shoulders relax, their laughter come more freely. Most importantly, I watched them stop performing and start being. Ellie began writing poetry, fragile, honest verses about clouds and dreams and the way light moved through leaves. She showed me her journal hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as she realized I treasured her unique perspective. Max's dinosaur fascination expanded to paleontology, then geology, then astronomy, connections forming in his remarkable mind that defied conventional categorization. He stopped apologizing for his enthusiasm, stopped monitoring his listeners' faces for signs of boredom or dismissal. I realized that in trying so desperately to make my parents see my children, I had sometimes failed to truly see them myself, to appreciate them exactly as they were, not as stepping stones to someone else's approval. 3 months passed without a word from my parents. Then came the accusatory phone call. Jessica says you've been keeping the kids from us, my mother began without preamble. Is this some kind of punishment? The familiar guilt rose like a tide, threatening to drown my resolve. But beside me on the couch, Ellie leaned against my arm, trusting and secure in a way she'd never been around my parents. I'm not keeping them from you, I replied calmly. I've simply stopped forcing a relationship that you've never seemed interested in. That's ridiculous. We love all our grandchildren equally. When was Max's birthday? I asked quietly. The silence stretched tellingly on the other end. You've missed the last 3, I continued. You've never asked about Ellie's anxiety. You don't even know what grade she's in. We're busy people. Jessica's children have so many activities. And mine don't matter, I finished. I've spent years watching my children try to make themselves smaller, quieter, more acceptable to earn your attention. I won't do that anymore. My father's voice suddenly broke in. This is extremely unfair. We've always been there for you. Have you? The question emerged softly, years of unacknowledged hurt behind it. Because my children are part of me, and you've never truly seen them. The conversation ended with my mother in tears and my father in cold anger. I sat afterward, shaking but strangely peaceful, like someone who has finally put down a heavy burden they'd carried so long they'd forgotten it wasn't part of their body. The fallout was immediate. My sister called, incredulous at my selfishness. Extended family members reached out, concerned about the misunderstanding. My father sent a text message filled with wounded indignation. After everything we've done for you. I felt a familiar wavering, the lifetime habit of smoothing things over at my own expense. But that evening, I watched Max and Ellie working together on a puzzle, their movements unself-conscious, voices animated. No performing, no anxious glances, no desperate attempts to be noticed. Just children existing freely in a space where they were valued. For months, I had carried a secret fear, that by establishing this boundary, I was depriving my children of grandparents. Now I understood that they had never truly had grandparents, not in the way that mattered. The text you've shared paints a powerful narrative of growth, healing, and setting boundaries for the sake of your children. It shows a deep reflection on family dynamics and how these dynamics shape one's identity. The shift from seeking approval to protecting your children and valuing them as they are is striking. My mother seemed smaller somehow, less certain in her movements. My father carried the stiff formality that had always been his shield against emotional discomfort. Max was the first to approach them, clutching his newest find, a geode he'd split open to reveal amethyst crystals. I found this at the quarry, he began, words tumbling out in his characteristic rush. Did you know that amethyst is a variety of quartz? It gets its purple color from iron impurities and irradiation, and sometimes there are layers that show the history of its formation, and... In the past, my mother would have cut him off, redirected the conversation. Today, she listened, awkwardly at first, then with growing attention. You really know a lot about this, she said when he paused for breath. Max blinked in surprise. Yeah, he said cautiously, I do. Later, Ellie hesitantly mentioned her art class. Could we see some of your work? My father asked. The careful hope on Ellie's face as she retrieved her sketchbook broke my heart and mended it simultaneously. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of discomfort, of my parents visibly restraining comments about behavior or comparisons to cousins. But it was a beginning, one where my children weren't contorting themselves to be seen. Watching them interact, I realized something profound. My children had never been the problem. Their differences, Max's intense focus and enthusiasm, Ellie's quiet sensitivity, weren't deficits to be overcome, but essential parts of who they were. The real issue had been the narrow lens through which my parents viewed them, a lens ground by conventional expectations and comfortable familiarity. Now that lens was being challenged, adjusted. Not because I had forced a confrontation, but because I had finally refused to participate in the fiction that everything was fine. As they were leaving, my mother paused at the door. I didn't realize, she said quietly. What? How much we were missing. Her eyes held mine with unusual vulnerability. They're extraordinary, aren't they? They always have been, I replied. They just needed you to notice. Healing isn't linear. In the months that followed, there were missteps and old patterns that threatened to resurface. Some family gatherings still left me drained, defending my children's differences. My sister remained convinced I was overdramatic, that I had manufactured a problem where none existed. There were still moments when my parents would unconsciously lavish attention on my niece and nephew while offering my children only polite interest. But something fundamental had shifted, not just in my parents' faltering attempts at connection, but in myself. I no longer felt responsible for making the relationship work at any cost. I had found the courage to name what had been happening, to challenge the comfortable fiction that all grandchildren were loved equally when actions clearly demonstrated otherwise. Most importantly, I had stopped trying to make my children more acceptable, more ordinary, more deserving of love. Instead, I had finally accepted the radical truth. They had always deserved it, exactly as they were. I see it now in Max's confident explanation of his sensory needs without shame, in Ellie's quiet assertion that she'd prefer to skip the crowded family reunion for her art competition, in my own voice, steady and clear when I say this doesn't work for us, without following it with justifications. The invisible children have become visible, first to me, then to themselves, and possibly in time to others. But their worth was never dependent on being seen by those unwilling to look. It existed independently, brilliantly all along. My greatest accomplishment wasn't making others recognize it, but creating the space where they could finally recognize it themselves. One evening, months after our first confrontation with my parents, Ellie asked me a question that caught me off guard. Do you think Grandma and Grandpa will ever love us like they love Amber and Jake? I sat beside her on her bed, choosing my words carefully. I think they're learning to love you for exactly who you are, which is even better than loving you the way they love your cousins. She considered this, her thoughtful eyes so like my own. Because we're different. Because you're you, I corrected gently. Unique and wonderful exactly as you are. She leaned against me, her body relaxing. I used to think I needed to be more like Amber. Now I just want to be more like me. The simplicity of her statement belied its profound truth. All along, I'd been fighting not just for my children to be seen, but for them to see themselves, to recognize their inherent value beyond comparison or external validation. As for me, I'm learning to accept that family healing doesn't always look like perfect reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like clear boundaries that make room for authentic, if limited, connection. Sometimes it looks like mourning the relationship you wished you had while building something new from the materials available. Sometimes it looks like teaching your children that love should never require them to be less than they are, even when that lesson contradicts everything you were taught. In this journey, I've discovered that healing doesn't mean the absence of pain or the erasure of difficult history. It means building something beautiful and true despite it, and sometimes because of it. It means transforming wounds into wisdom and passing that wisdom down instead of passing down the wounds. My children are teaching me, as much as I'm teaching them, about resilience, about authenticity, about the courage to exist unapologetically in a world that doesn't always make space for difference. Together, we're writing a new story about what family means, one where being seen is the beginning, not something to be earned. And in that story, there are no invisible children.